In the spring of 1922, a quiet farm in rural Bavaria became the center of one of Germany's most enduring mysteries. 6 people lived there. Days later, all 6 were dead. But what unsettled investigators the most was not only the crime itself, it was what happened before it. Footprints appearing in the snow that led toward the house, but never away. Strange noises coming from the attic, a missing key, and signs that someone may have been inside the farm long before the murders were discovered. More than a century later, the question still lingers. Who was at Hinterkaifeck? And why were they never found? The farm known as Hinterkaifeck stood in the Bavarian countryside, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. It was small and isolated, surrounded by open fields and patches of forest. The nearest village was close enough for neighbors to visit, but the farm itself sat quietly apart from the rest of the community. The property belonged to Andreas Gruber. He lived there with his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 young children, Cecilia and Joseph, and in late March of 1922, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner joined the household. She had arrived only hours before the tragedy would unfold. 6 people, a simple farm. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But in the days before the crime, Andreas Gruber reportedly mentioned several strange events to neighbors. He had noticed footprints in the snow. They appeared to come from the nearby forest, leading toward the farmyard. But there were no footprints going back the other way. Whoever had walked there had not left. Gruber searched the property but found no one. Soon after, he began hearing unusual noises. At times, it sounded like footsteps coming from the attic above the living quarters. When he investigated, the attic appeared empty. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. Yet the sounds continued. Around the same time, one more detail troubled the family. A key to the house had disappeared. At the time, these events were unsettling, but they were not treated as serious threats. Life on a farm was busy, and strange noises or misplaced items could easily be explained away. But, in hindsight, these small clues would become some of the most haunting parts of the story, because just days later, the entire household would be found dead. On April 4, 1922, neighbors began to grow concerned. Several days had passed without seeing anyone from the farm. The children had not appeared at school. Mail had begun to collect, and the animals still needed care. Eventually, concerned neighbors and local residents went to check on the property. What they discovered inside the barn shocked them. 4 members of the household had been killed there. The scene suggested that the victims had been lured or called into the barn one by one. Later, investigators discovered the remaining victims inside the house. No one in the family had survived. Authorities were quickly called, and an investigation began. But almost immediately, the case presented a troubling reality. The crime scene was complex. Witnesses had already moved through the area, and the remote location meant there were few clear clues pointing to a suspect. Even so, investigators began gathering testimony from neighbors and nearby residents, and what they heard only deepened the mystery. Because several people remembered the strange events Andreas Gruber had mentioned shortly before the murders. The footprints, the attic noises, the missing key. Individually, these details might have meant little, but together they raised a disturbing possibility. Someone might have been watching the farm, or even hiding there, As investigators continued their work, another detail emerged that made the case even more unsettling. Evidence suggested that someone may have remained at the farm for several days after the murders. Animals were fed, smoke was seen rising from the chimney, and neighbours passing by noticed nothing unusual at first. This suggested that whoever committed the crime might not have left immediately. Instead, they may have stayed on the property, continuing the routine of daily farm life. This possibility deeply puzzled investigators. Why would a killer remain at the scene, and how did no one see them? Over time, authorities questioned numerous people connected to the family: neighbours, relatives, travellers passing through the region, anyone who might have had contact with the household. Several possible motives were considered. One theory suggested robbery, but money and valuables appeared to remain at the farm. Another theory involved personal conflict. Some investigators examined the family's relationships and disputes within the local community. But none of these lines of inquiry produced a clear suspect. Despite extensive questioning, the investigation never reached a definitive conclusion. Years passed, then decades. But the mystery of Hinterkaifeck continued to fascinate investigators and historians. What makes the case so haunting is not only the crime itself, but the strange events that seemed to precede it. The footprints in the snow, the unexplained sounds in the attic, the missing key, and the unsettling possibility that someone may have secretly been living on the farm before the murders were discovered. Each clue hints at a chilling scenario: that the victims may not have been alone in their home, that someone may have been watching them from the shadows. Yet none of these clues could ever be fully proven. Investigators continued to examine the case over the years. New suspects were proposed, old testimonies were revisited, but the truth remained just out of reach. Eventually, the farm itself was demolished. The buildings were removed and the land returned to farmland. Today, nothing remains of the house where the events unfolded. Only open fields mark the place where Hinterkaifeck once stood. Yet the story refuses to fade, because the case still raises unsettling questions. Who walked through the snow toward the farm? Who moved through the attic at night? And who stayed behind after the crime, quietly feeding the animals and tending the fire? More than a century later, the mystery of Hinterkaifeck remains unsolved. A quiet farm, 6 lives lost, and a story that still lingers in the shadows of history. Sometimes history gives us clear answers, but sometimes it leaves only silence and a trail of footprints that never return.